Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim Daf Mem. This week's learning is sponsored by Naomi and Adam Ferziger in memory of Naomi's father, David Weiss, Chaim Ze'ev Ben Pesel, and Yoel Greenblatt to commemorate his 10th yahrzeit. He was a Holocaust survivor who proudly rebuilt his life. Kind, generous, and with a good sense of humor, he was devoted to his family and community. This week's learning is sponsored by Romy and Josh Sussman in honor of our second son, who will be joining his oldest brother in the IDF this week in defense of our country and our people. B'hatzlacha. Today's daf is sponsored by Diana Bloom in loving memory of her Babi, Ita Rosa Sanaben Maramik on her yahrzeit. Today's daf is sponsored by Debbie Engelin Eigels in honor of the bris of her first grandchild. May have a long, happy, and healthy life and bring joy to all who know him. A lot of good things to be celebrating and some yahrzeits as well. Okay, we're going to start at the bottom of Lamed Tet Amud. Very interesting dapim, all about the importance of the mitzvah of visiting sick people. So we start with a story today. Rav Chelbo Chalash. Rav Chelbo was sick. Nafek Achriz Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana went out and announced to everybody, Rav Chelbo Baish. Rav Chelbo is sick, basically telling them, go visit Rav Chelbo. Well, lo ika de ka'ate. Nobody came. Nobody went to visit him. Very sad. Amar lihu. Rav Kahana got very upset. He said to everybody, Lo kachayama talmid achami talmidei Rabbi Akiva shechala. Don't you know the famous story of one of Rabbi Akiva's students who was sick? Lo nichnesu chachamim levakro. None of the sages went to go visit him. V'nichnas Rabbi Akiva levakro. Only Rabbi Akiva went, and when Rabbi Akiva went in to visit him, ubishvil shekibdu v'ribtzu lefanav chaya. The way this seems to be explained as kibdu v'ribtzu means they cleaned the floors and swept up, cleaned up the place. It seems that Rabbi Akiva went in and saw the dire situation of the room that the sick person was living in. And it was a mess. It was a total disaster zone. And he seems like he had people. That's why it says Ribtzu v'kivdu in plural. Rabbi Akiva sent for people to clean up the room of this sick person. And as a result, chaya, the person lived. Okay, and as sometimes you're living in a mess and you just feel like the world is hopeless and there's nowhere to go from here. And that enables you to kind of just move on to moving on. And Rabbi Akiva, now you see here all of a sudden a different reason that we haven't really related to about Bikur Cholim, which is you need to see what the needs of the sick person are. And if you don't go visit them, you won't actually know what their needs are. Rabbi Akiva walked in, saw that this person needed order in their lives, got people together to basically fix up this person's living space. And Amar Le, Rebbe Hachayitani, he said to Rabbi Akiva, you brought me back to life. Okay, you gave me hope to live. You organized things, right? We don't know what else Rabbi Akiva did, but whatever it was, he saw his needs. Yatzar Rabbi Akiva v'darash. So Rabbi Akiva went out and said, Kol mi she'ein mevaker cholim ki'ilu shofech damim. He says, if you don't go visit sick people, it's almost as if you're causing their death. Okay, you're spilling blood. Basically, you're causing this person to die. It's very severe what he's saying, right? But also very understandable. So before we move on, I want to go back for a minute because I want to talk about something that we discussed. One of the very first things we learned when we got to the sugya was at the beginning of Lamed Tet Amud Aleph. It says this whole thing about if you can't benefit from someone, you can still go visit them. And then the Ran had explained that why are you allowed to visit them? The Ran had said, okay, in the first Ran on Daf Lamed Tet, de omed my time is sharit. Why are you allowed to stand when you go visit? Right, and then the basic question was, well, then for those reasons you can even sit. And they were trying to understand the Mishnah why standing is okay, sitting is not okay. Mishum de mevaker mitzvah dinafshe adu. When you go visit someone, you're basically doing the mitzvah. You're doing it almost like it sounds selfishly for your own sake. V'nichi de chole mitani mimela shari. Since the sick person is only benefiting from you're doing the mitzvah. The main goal, you're doing a mitzvah. It's not that you're really trying to help the sick person. That's why you're allowed to go visit them. And that's why, the question of the Gemara there was why the difference between sitting and standing. And then they answered, that was later. But it was a very difficult thing to swallow. If we go visit a sick person because we're trying to do a mitzvah, it's true. We're trying to do a mitzvah, but we're really trying to help the sick person. So this sugya is trying to highlight, and we're going to have a bunch of different things that we're going to see. First, going to visit a sick person makes you aware of their needs. And once you're aware of their needs, you can actually help them to get better. So in fact, this kind of turns over, kind of overturns what we saw before, that you're not just doing it for the mitzvah. There's all sorts of other reasons for visiting sick people. So, and we're going to see helping them, number one, from a physical standpoint or a real standpoint in terms of seeing what their needs are and trying to fulfill their needs. And the next is this next line. Ki'ata Rav Dimi, where Rav Dimi came, Amal, when he came from Israel, he brought the Torah of Israel to Babylonia, and he said, anyone who visits a sick person causes him to live. This sounds very much like Rabbi Akiva. And anyone who doesn't visit a sick person causes their death. Sounds like what Rabbi Akiva is saying, but you're going to see is going to come at it from a different angle, or at least the way the Gemara is going to explain. My grandma, what exactly is causing their death or them to live? Ilema, if you want to say, maybe it is, well, if you go visit a sick person, you're going to pray for them. They see this correlation between going to visit someone and praying for them. Also, reasonable correlation, because when you see someone, you internalize, right? Sometimes we hear someone sick. Okay, you hear about it. You might pray for them, but it's not the same as when you see them and you see what situation they're in, and then you go pray for them. So now let's try to understand the second line of that sentence based on our explanation. So if you go visit them, you'll see that they need praying and you'll pray for them, that they live. That's the first part. Okay, well then the continuation would be, if you don't visit a sick person, then you're praying for their death. And that's why you're basically killing them. To which the Gemara says, you think people are praying because you don't go visit a sick person, you're praying that they die? Of course, that's not the case. So we're a little bit stuck with how to understand the sentence, to which the Gemara says, I'm going to explain the sentence in two different ways. First, the way it's explained by most commentaries, the simple reading, which is, if you don't go visit a sick person, then you're basically just neutral. You're not praying for them that they live. You might not be praying for them that they die, but you're not praying for them that they're going to live either. So you're basically not helping them. So now that's one way of explaining this. The Ran learned something very interesting from this line. He takes this line very literally, and he says, what it means is if you don't go visit them, you're not going to pray for them either to live or to die. Now, what does he mean by this? So the Ran says, if you look in the first line of the Ran, it seems to me like this is what the Gemara is saying. That sometimes you actually need to pray for their death. Sometimes people are at the end, and what you really want to pray for is that it finishes, right? That they die, because they're suffering so much. And what's our proof? Remember the famous story in Ketubot, end of Ketubot with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and everyone was praying for his death. And then the maidservant said, remember, she switches her words. First, she was saying, we want the people below to, pray for the people, that they should overpower the people up above that are trying to take his life away. And then when she saw how much he was suffering, she said, let the ones above win the war here, win the battle. And basically, what the Ran is saying is, what it means here is that sometimes you need to go and see the situation to understand whether you should be praying for their life or whether you should be praying for their death. And it's a very interesting halacha about, that seems from here, the way the Ran understands it and that story, that you actually can pray, because, it's questionable. Okay, are you allowed to pray for somebody's death? And it seems that you are. Okay, if that's the situation is so dire that sometimes that's what's best. Rava Yoma Kadma'a de Chalish Amar Lahon. Now we're going to have another thing about, what if you're the sick person? Do you want to tell people that you're sick? This is a very common thing. Some people are very secretive about things. Some people are very open about things. Some people want everyone to know. Some people don't want anybody to know. So Rava splits it into first day and other days. He says, the first day I'm sick, Amar Lahon, he said to them, Lo Tigalu Leinish, don't tell anybody. Delo Litra Mazale, because he didn't want his mazal to go bad. Now, what this means, right? Maybe given Manayin Hara, I don't know exactly how to explain this, but he thought that it would cause things to shift in a bad direction. Mikava Elach, Amar Lahon, from, also sometimes you're not sure how sick you really are. People start talking about that you're sick, and maybe that'll really make you sick, and either it's self-perception, people are looking at you as sick, maybe somewhere in a in a metaphysical way. Everyone's talking that you're sick. Maybe that will actually cause you to be more sick. Maybe that's another way to look at it. Mikam ve'elach, after that though, after day one, Amar Lahon, Puku v'achariza b'shuka. And who's he talking to? He's obviously not talking to the people that were his family or people that were helping him. So first he said, don't tell anybody. After the first day, he said, Puku v'achariza b'shuka. Go out and announce it in the shuk. Now, why? This is interesting where he starts with, you would have thought at least he'd switch the order, but no, he says, everyone who hates me will be happy for me that I'm sick. Interesting to think that Rava had all these enemies. Now, why is that a good thing? Well, it says, don't be happy when your enemy falls. And then the continuation, the next pasuk is, God will see and say, oh, that's not a good thing, that he's happy for his enemy that's down. God will move away his anger from that person. So, my enemies get all excited, then God will actually make me feel better. And the ones who like me and who have pity for me, they will pray for my getting better. So now there's this interesting thing about separation, the split between the first day and the last day. So again, either the first day, you're not really sure how sick you are and whether you need it or not. By day number 2, even though right nowadays you might say maybe not day number 2, but maybe after a few days, you realize that it's much worse. There's a great footnote in the Koran that quotes Rav Kook, who, and I'm going to paraphrase it, and maybe I'm reading it exactly in my way, the way I view it. So you can read the footnote there as well and see, and it would be better if we opened it in Rav Kook himself. But the idea here, I'm just kind of paraphrasing and saying in my own words, which is that there's this idea that when you're sick in the beginning, glance at it while I say so I don't say this wrong, but the idea is that he even says it really well. Maybe I'll even read it. That self-reliance is one of the most valuable and significant qualities of the human psyche. For many people, dependence upon others or inability to fend for oneself is a source of embarrassment and indication of personal failure. So I'm not sure how much of this is Steinsal's commentary and how much of it is Rav Kook. So that's why I said I didn't look at it inside in Rav Kook. So it'd be interesting to see what the translation is. But basically, it talks about how it's very hard for people to be reliant on other people. And therefore, in the beginning, when you're sick, you want to basically have this sense that I can handle it. And you don't want other people's involvement. But then, right, he says, even when suffering from an illness that saps one's strength, it is psychologically deleterious to turn to others for help in resolving the issue before attempting to cope alone. Therefore, the Gemara recommends waiting a day before publicizing one's distress. This important quality, however, should be tempered by a realistic assessment of one's capabilities. It's a fascinating, right? This is so obvious, but brilliantly put. And yet society exists to enable people to rely on one another. Once it becomes clear that outside attendance is required, accepting help from others forgoes societal bonds and leads to close relationships between people that facilitate formation of a community. It's a beautiful idea. And how basically you have to balance always your feeling of, I want to do this myself. And anyone who's been sick and in a situation like this knows how it feels. You want to be able to do it yourself. On the other hand, at a certain point, you need help from people. And you need to understand that there's value to that, not just for you, but for them as well, and for the building of community. And that's what builds community. When people need help, they're in a state of needing the help, and then the community comes together, and that strengthens the community. So that's why Rava said, first, a day, and whether it's a day or a week or whatever it might be, the first period, kind of keep it together, try to do it yourself. When you realize, though, that you can't anymore, then, be willing to ask for help. Don't say, I can do this myself when you really can't. So it's a very important concept and very real. Okay, so what I liked about it is, often these comments like itrale mazale, where it sounds like some metaphysical thing going on. For me, I always identify better when you understand it in a real way of what's really happening in the world, rather than there's obviously a connection between those things, but that these halachot are not just up there in some metaphysical plane, but it's rooted in reality and in things that go on a daily basis. Okay, so let's just review what we had so far. We have, again, if we start back with yesterday, the importance of visiting a sick person is for your own sake, to do a mitzvah. Comes the Gemara here and says, well, that's not enough, because if we just do that, maybe some people won't do the mitzvah. We had all these situations where people weren't, and we're going to see, particularly from what we saw so far, and from the continuation, that it seems like we're attacking this from all different angles. Number one, it's because there are all different aspects involved here. Number one, yes, it's for a mitzvah. Number two, it's helping the sick person either on a physical plane because you realize their needs, or on a metaphysical plane, we're praying for them. Okay, where prayer we view is very important, right? From a spiritual perspective. So there's physical help, there's spiritual help. These are all helping the sick person to get better, seeing their needs. Maybe it even is to pray for their death, possibly. And then we're going to get into what is the reward for this mitzvah. And it seems that the Gemara is attacking this from all different angles, partially because it's a mitzvah that has all different elements to it. And secondly, it seems, certainly from our story that we started with, and we saw this on two occasions, that people weren't doing this mitzvah. And the next line is going to remind you, possibly, if you remember from a Masechet Shabbat, when we had eating 3 meals on Shabbat, and we talked about Sudash Lashit. It's not the easiest mitzvah. It's very hard. You ate a lot of food for lunch, and now you have to eat another meal, especially this time of year when Shabbat is so short. Very challenging to eat Sudash Lashit. And in fact, the Gemara says something very similar here, that if you eat 3 meals on Shabbat, you're saved from Gog Magog, Gehenom, right? You're saved from all these things. And they're trying to push it because they're seeing that people aren't doing it. So the same thing here. We're going to have this line right now. Amarav, kol ha'mevaker et hacholeh nitzol midina shel Gehenom. If you visit a sick person, you're saved from Gehenom, from hell. Again, these are ways that the rabbis, and we're going to try to prove it from a pasuk, it's going to be a little bit of a stretch. And they're just basically trying to tell people, this is an important mitzvah, go out and do it, because people weren't necessarily doing it, right? Why weren't people doing it? There's all sorts of reasons why we don't visit sick people, right? You don't know what to say. It's uncomfortable. You don't know whether it's good for them, whether it's not good for them. You don't have the time in your life. You're busy. It's not one of the things in your usual schedule. So here they're saying this is a super important mitzvah and make sure to go ahead and do it. So now we're going to see where do we know that you're saved from Gehenom? Shenema asherei maskil eldal b'yom ra'a yamateu Hashem. So it says those who maskil, which, okay, however exactly you translate it, but basically if you help the dal. Now, dal is normally a poor person. In this situation, it's going to be a sick person. And we're going to have to prove how we know that dal could refer also to a sick person. B'yom ra'a yamateu Hashem. So happy is the one who helps the sick, which we're going to say visits the sick person, even though it sounds like helps the poor. And on a bad day, the bad day, God will save you. So now, first you have to prove dal is sick, and then you have to prove bad day is Gehenom. Ein dal ela choleh, shenemar midala yivatzeni. This is from Chizkiyahu the king. He was sick, and in his prayer he says, from my dalut, which for him it wasn't poverty, it was sickness, yivatzeni, God will redeem me. Inami min hadinkra, a very strange pasuk to use here. Madua ata kacha dal ben hamelech baboker baboker. This is Amnon and Tamar, if you remember, the whole story where he ends up raping her, and he was lovesick over her. And the word used by his friend Yonadav is to say, why are you dal? Why are you sick? Which means lovesick here, but sick, baboker baboker, every morning. And then ein ra'a ela gehenom shenemar kol pa'al Hashem lemaneu v'gam rasha liyom ra'a. We saw this before. We saw this post recently. Right, everything God does for His own sake, even delivering the bad person on his bad day, which we assume is Gehenom. So that's how we know the ra'a in our pasuk is Gehenom, and the dal is the poor person. So there you have it. If you visit the poor person, you will be saved from Gehenom. V'im bikir mascharo, and if you visit the sick person, what is your reward? To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Mascharo. Kida'amar, nitzol midina shel Gehenom. We just said what your reward is. Why are you asking what the reward is? We just said a minute ago, you'll be saved from Gehenom. Ela mascharo ba'olam hazeh. They're saying, oh no, we want to know what the reward is in this world. That's in some next world. When we die. We want to know what the reward is in this world. Interesting, they have this assumption. Again, I think they're just trying to get at it from all different angles. If it's not enough for you to say we're going to save you from Gehenom, let's try to say some other things you're going to have. So now they quote a pasuk from Tehillim. Hashem ishmereu v'yichayehu. God will watch over him and have him live. V'ushar ba'aretz. He'll be happy in the land. V'al tigneu b'nefesh oivav. And he will not be given into his enemies. Strangest explanation of this whole pasuk. We're going to explain each section is going to be the enemy part. It's going to be explained a little differently, right? If you would read that, you'd say, you won't fall into the hands of their enemy, your enemies, and your enemies won't kill you, right? That's usually what we think of enemies are going to do to you, but they're going to explain it a little bit differently. Hashem yishmerehu miyetzer hara. God will protect you, that's the beginning of the verse, from the evil inclination. Yichayehu, you'll be brought back to life, mina yisurim. So you might have suffering, but God will take you out of it. V'ushar ba'aretz, what does it mean? You'll be happy in the land. Shua kol mitkabdim bo. Everybody will be respected through you. What does that mean? Some people actually change it to kol mechabdim otam. Everyone will respect you, give you respect. But the translation mitkabdim bo means if, let's say it's me and you're my friend, you'll walk around saying, oh, I'm Michelle's friend, and that will give you respect. That's what it means, mitkabdim bo. So you'll use me to get respect. If you're connected with me, you're associated with me, that already puts you in a different place. That's what it means, mitkabdim bo. So again, we would assume this means you won't be delivered into the hands of your enemy. We just talked about Naaman. You'll have friends like Naaman who helped him with his leprosy. How did they help him with his leprosy? They recommended to him to go to Elisha. They gave him good advice. Basically, your friend is going to be one who gives you good advice, and your enemy might be your friend, but it's going to be a friend who gives you bad advice. And that is called enemy, which is very interesting to think that you wouldn't think of those people as your enemy, but in the end, they bring upon your downfall. And that is going to be used as an example of Rechavam. If you remember the story, talk about it in a minute. The friends of Rechavam gave him bad advice, right? They were his friends, but they were obviously friends that were not the right kind of friends. It's basically saying is your enemies are basically bad friends, which is an interesting translation of enemy. It's basically friends that steer you in the wrong direction. So now, Siman Ledavar, Rechavam, I skipped Tanya. Here's a brighter. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Im Yomru Lecha Yeladim B'nei Uskenim Stol. If your younger people give you this advice to build, and at the same time, elderly people are saying you should tear it apart, Shema L'Zkenim, even though it sounds better to build, sometimes building is bad and sometimes taking down things is a good thing. So listen to the elderly people, the Al Tishma Yeladim. Okay, the older people know what they're talking about. Don't listen to the younger people. Shebinyan Yeladim Stira Ustirat Zkenim Binyan. Sometimes building of the youth is actually could be destructive, whereas destroying things what the older people are recommending to you is actually building. V'siman ledavar Rechavam ben Shlomo. And what's the way to remember this? Just think about Rechavam. So what was the story of Rechavam? He was the son of Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo put a big tax on the people in order to build the Beit HaMikdash and his palace, and they had to work and they had to give money, and it was too much for the people. And when he died and Rechavam took over, basically, and then Yeravam at the same time was building up his kingdom, which was the competitive kingdom. That was the whole split. So the people complained to Rechavam and said, we don't want this tax anymore. Please lower the taxes. And his friends said, don't listen to them. You should raise the taxes, which is in fact what Rechavam did. The older people there said, listen to the people, give in to them, right? The young people said, be tough, say, I'm king, I'm in charge, you have to listen to me. And the older people said, this is not a good situation. If you go against them, they're going to go and vote for Yeravam and you're going to lose your kingdom, which is exactly what happened. He remained king, but over a very small amount of people. And basically, he didn't listen to their advice. And that's what the Gemara is saying is have enemies, which is people who give you bad advice. It basically sounds like choosing the wrong group of friends and the wrong advisors. Okay. Amar Rav Shesha Bered Rav Idi. Lo lisod. Lisod has two meanings. Lisod is siuda, a meal, but lisod, modern Hebrew, siudi is someone who needs help, right? Like you need a helper, but that, all kinds of different help. It's someone who's sick who needs help, or not necessarily sick the way we think of sick, but someone who needs help. So lo lisod inish katsira, here it means don't visit the sick person. Here it means to help the sick person. Don't come visit them. Inish katsira means a person who's sick. Lo bitlat shai kadmayata, lo bitlat shai batriyata. The Yoma. Don't come in the first 3 hours of the day and don't come in the last 3 hours of the day. Why not? You might end up not praying for them. Why? In the morning, people are the most clear-headed and they're actually feeling better. Actually, if you're sick, you get a decent night's sleep, you're feeling a little better when you wake up in the morning. And batriata takif chulshe. And at nighttime, it's usually when the fever goes up. The fever spikes at night often. So that's, you're looking worse. So why is that going to prevent someone from praying for you? Well, if they see you in the first morning hours, early morning hours, they'll say, oh, you're looking pretty good. I don't need to pray for you. If they see you in the late hours, either we go back to the Ran and say they might pray for your death. They'll see how much you're suffering. Or they might just not pray and think this is, like there's no point for me to pray because this is the end. So therefore, you shouldn't go in those hours because it might not give you a good assessment of how the person is. Other people explain that these are the hours. I think in the Steinsaltz, they actually translate that people are preoccupied with their sickness at those hours, right? In hospitals, it's when the doctors do their rounds in the morning, right? It's not a good time to come in and visit when the doctor's going to show up right then. So what it's basically saying is time your visit properly, not when it's good for you, but when it's good for the sick person, right? You might think also the best time, you have to think about also when's the best time to visit someone before you go to work or when you come home from work. And that's in the morning or the late afternoon, or evening. So it's not necessarily, though, the best time for the sick person. Ama Ravin, Ama Rav. Now, remember that Ravin said this in the name of Rav. So we're going to get off on some tangents based on Ravin saying things in the name of Rav that seem to have nothing to do with this. Ravin says in the name of Rav, Minayin Shakadosh Baruch Hu Zan et HaCholeh. How do you know that God is the one who sustains? God kind of gets involved directly and helps give food to this poor person, this sick person. Shneimar Hashem Isadeni al Eres Dvai. Okay, that means God will, again, this language of Yisadeni, we're going to have two translations of it. One is first to say, he gives you a seudah on your bed, on your sick bed. Okay, it's a pasuk from Tehillim also. God basically nourishes you on your sick bed. Another statement, he said, a different drashot on this pasuk, because God is sustaining, that means also that God is present there. And what does it say? Hashem Yisadeni, Shenemar Hashem Yisadeni al Eres Dvai, on top of the bed. That's how he translates it, meaning God's presence hovers over the bed of a sick person. And what's the halacha that comes out of this? Tanya Nami Hachi, a brighter to support this. Hanichnas levaker tacholeh. If you go in to visit a sick person, lo yeshev lo agabe mitah velo agabe safsal. Don't sit on a bed. Don't sit on a bench. Velo agabe kisei, and not on a chair. Ela mitatef yoshev agabe karka. You should cover yourself up, which is not clear why cover yourself up. Some people even think maybe the sick person should cover themselves, or you should cover yourself. And sit on the floor, maybe to make yourself as low as possible. And maybe that's why you cover your head also, like as humility. Also, maybe not to see the Shechina, because the Shechina is right there. So from this pasuk, they learn that you should always be sitting lower than the sick person. So some people quote this halacha that you really have to. Some people say that it's only when the sick person is actually on the floor, and we're not really on the floor anymore, right? Sick people, you don't generally see sick people that are sitting on the floor, so maybe it's not as relevant. Okay. There were two things I wanted to just remember now. I forgot to say this in the Hebrew. I wanted to show you in the Rambam. So the Rambam says here, when he quotes this, he says, right, so the Rambam's the one who says here, the Rambam says it explicitly. That's where it was, that they're basically, those are the hours that the choleh is involved in dealing with their sickness. Where he gets that from is a good question. Remember, the Rambam was a doctor, also interesting. So he also says, by the way, he adds this other thing, which we didn't see, which is not people who have intestinal problems or problems with their eyes, and not terrible headaches, because those people don't really want visitors. It's harder for them to visit with people. Another good thing to know. And, to be conscious of, is it good for them or not? You always have to ask before you come, do you want visitors or you're not in the mood for visitors? And then when he quotes this halacha, not to sit on all that, he says, he adds these words. He says, he basically says, why are you sitting on the floor and why are you covering yourself? It sounds like when people daven, they sometimes put their talit over their heads, because you're supposed to be praying, which it doesn't say it here, but he understands it is when you go in, since God is in the room, that's where you should be praying, right? It's interesting. You would think, okay, when I visit the sick person, I don't pray in front of them. I pray when I go out, I realize how sick they are, and then I think about them and I pray. The Rambam understands you should be praying for them in the room right there. because that's where God's presence is. So that's your best place to pray. Okay. Now we're moving on from our topic. We'll get back to it tomorrow. But right now we're on a tangent of Amar Rav and Amar Rav. So another statement that Rav said in the name of Rav. Rav, if you remember, was one of the Nechute, people who traveled from Israel to Babylonia and brought the Torah usually from Israel to Babylonia. In this case, he's quoting Rav, who's from Babylonia. It's interesting that he's saying this because he lives in Israel, but was traveling, or he lived in both places, really. He says, if you're living in Babylonia and you want to know if it rained in Israel this season, you want to know, was it a good year? You know, we're always worried about people who live outside of Israel. How's it going in Israel nowadays? It's pretty easy. You can look at the news. You can look at, you can find out any way you want. But in those days, it wasn't so easy. So we said, you look at the Nahar Prat, the Euphrates River. If the Euphrates is full, then you know that it rained a lot in Israel because the rainwater trickles down and gets to the Euphrates, okay, between the rain and the snow melting and all that from the mountains. Upliga de Shmuel. This disagrees with Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel. The Nahar Prat actually gets not from the rainwater in Israel, it's from its own banks, okay, from rainwater that comes in that maybe seeps in the ground and comes back up, or from the little streams that are nearby that fill up with the rainwater and then stream into the Euphrates. And it's its own water and it's not coming from Israel, and therefore it's no indicator. Now, why is this relevant at all? Well, there's a very important halakhic relevance to it, and that's for laws of mikveh. The way a mikveh works is a mikveh can be either rainwater or it can be water, stream water, which we call in the Gemara zochalim, means water that moves. So there's two kinds of water. Either there's standing water or stationary water, or water that's streaming. If it's stationary water from rain, then you can use it as a mikveh. If it's streaming water, then you can use it as a mikveh. But if it's water in a stream or a river that is the majority, though, is made up of rainwater, let's say you assume that the Euphrates is full from the rainwater that's coming from Israel, then you can't use it as a mikveh. It has to have majority streaming water and not majority rainwater. So basically, Rav, who says the Euphrates fills up from the rain in Israel, then it becomes, at some point, you don't know really, there's no way to know how much of it is rainwater, how much of it is streamed water. So therefore, or moving water, running water, I should say, how much of it is running, how much of it is stationary, then you wouldn't be able to use it. So Rav, you would say that the Euphrates can't be used as a mikveh, and Shmuel, who thinks that it's filling up from its own banks, then it would be fine. Okay, it could be used. We can assume that it's not majority rainwater. So now the Gemara points out, pliga de Shmuel ad Shmuel. Shmuel contradicts himself because Shmuel here says, theoretically, where would you get to halacha that you'd be able to use the Euphrates all the time? But Shmuel elsewhere said, Amar Shmuel, ein hamayim mitahalim b'zochalim. Water is not pure for a mikveh from zochalim, from stream water in general, streaming water, ela prat b'yomei Tishrei bilbad, other than one river, which is the Euphrates, and specifically in Tishrei. Why Tishrei? Because Tishrei is after 6 months of no rainy season, basically, and the new rainy season hasn't started. You can assume only in that month that the majority of the water is not rainwater anymore. But every other month, either because the rainy season started or because the rainy season, right, we still have snow running down and rainwater for a while until that kind of is no longer, you can't use it. So Shmuel contradicts himself, and the Gemara is not going to bring us an explanation for this contradiction. Okay, we're already on Amud Bet, and you see Amud Bet is only 5 lines. It was fun when that happens, and the Daf Yomi. So anyway, Avua de Shmuel, we're now going to hear about the father of Shmuel. Avid lahom mikvaot lebinte biyomi Nisan, umapatze biyomi Tishrei. So likewise, his father would make mikvaot for his daughters. He wouldn't let them go in the Euphrates in the months of Nisan, but he would put mats on the ground in the months of Tishrei in the Euphrates and let them go in the Euphrates itself. Because if they went in the Euphrates in the days of Tishrei, that was okay. So here you see, he holds like Shmuel. Well, it was his father. Shmuel kind of held like his father, which is, now what's the deal with the mats? Why mats? So that seems to be, there's a bunch of different explanations. I'll go with one of them. If you don't have mats, then the mud gets into their feet, and then it could be a chatzitza, separation. So therefore, they would put mats down in the Euphrates, and then they would use it as a mikveh, but only in Tishrei. It's an obvious question here, which I won't get to the answer, but the obvious question is, what about the other months of the year? Right? According to Shmuel, it was only Tishrei it was allowed, all the other months of the year it wasn't allowed. His father only talks about Nisan and Tishrei, which often mean periods of time of the year and not necessarily, like summer period and winter period, or here it's kind of like in between season period. So it's unclear what his father did the rest of the time of the year. Okay, from this, we're going to just start this next line. We're not going to really deal with it today, but Amar Rabbi Ami Amar Rav. Why this is here, either it's another statement in the name of Rav, but not by Ravin, so it's a little bit strange, because usually the Gemara takes statements that are, whatever, and it's a totally different topic. Some people have the girsa that it's Amar Ravin Amar Rav, that it's another statement that Ravin said in the name of Rav. Some people actually say that the previous statement was Rabbi Ami, and somehow we got to that. Some people connect it because they're going to talk about a shatiach, and a shatiach is like a mat, and that maybe that's why. It's a little bit unclear, the connection here and what this is doing here. So we'll just get started and we'll talk about this more tomorrow. Yechezkel is told that he should make implements of exile. What are those? Okay, so we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, and we'll try to figure out what this is talking about. Maybe we can think of a connection between all these things and why this is all here. It's a bit of a question, whether it's a random, whether there's a reason, what this has to do with our topic of visiting the sick. So I'll leave you with that. You can think till tomorrow. Anyway, we'll get back to this tomorrow. Have a great week. Have a great day. And go out and do the mitzvah bikor cholim if that it wasn't clear from today's daf. Make the time, even though it might be difficult and challenging. And again, while you're doing it, be sensitive to all the issues and make sure that what you're doing is also as actually beneficial for the sick person. Because in the end, even though you're doing it for the mitzvah, don't lose sight of who you're visiting and what their needs are as well. Have a great day.